And I know that this is a very difficult subject matter, and to the point of that's come up in the previous discussions, excuse me, of these tangible versus intangible, and the impacts of the real impacts on tribal communities that is created as a result of this activity associated with NAGPRA. Having to internally determine or develop new practices that are maybe rooted in a traditional or cultural process for accepting or welcoming back objects into the community. In the case of the objects that are not authentic, many tribes have, as some of the gentlemen have alluded to, have had to create a process. And, at Acoma, that happened also. And it created such a contentious atmosphere within the religious societies that at some point the tribal religious leaders said, no. If Acoma is going to make a claim on objects of cultural patrimony, they must be authentic. They must be, someone at the Pueblo must identify them as such before any investment of time and resources are made in the repatriation of these objects. And that there would be no more discussion about having to create more new processes at home. So, and this varies from one community to the next. And so when we consider NAGPRA, and while as Mr. As Leigh has, and I've called everyone Mr. Mr. by their last name. Leigh's last name is very difficult for me to pronounce, so that's why I'm calling him Leigh tonight. But as we consider the NAGPRA law and some of the reactions that have occurred as a result of these recent Paris auctions, and in light of some of the auctions that are on schedule, there are some that I think there's one coming up in a couple of weeks.
All over the world.
Yeah, well, yeah.
Not just Paris, all over the world.
So, some organizations and agencies and tribes, coalitions are reacting and maybe considering the support of other national organizations. Maybe they're seeking legal counsel on some of these issues. What do you all think are some of the more immediate and best solutions at this point relative to addressing the issue with international sale and trade, but then also looking at this law that we have in the States and giving it a little more teeth? I mean, this has also come up in previous discussions, that there needs to be an evaluation of NAGPRA, a thorough evaluation that maybe leads to some amendments to the existing law. What are some of your thoughts regarding this?
We can start with something. Okay. Maybe all of us, our tribes were involved with the design of NAGPRA, and you're right, Brian. Yeah, it's time for evaluation and reflection to make things better. I think laws and guidelines and others like this should be additive. They should be always getting better. One that I see that should have some real consideration and action, actually, on behalf of especially the tribes. And I should say that there's a reason we're not one tribe. We're all very different, right? Otherwise we'd be just one tribe, but we're not. But we do things differently, and we respect each other's ways of doing things. But for the tribes anyway, it's important to have on the books, whether it's a law and order code, but something on the books that items made in Zuni or the places are the property of the tribe. And if they have left the reservation, then they have been stolen. The problem with some of these things, and whether it's identified or not, but the problem with these in the early 1900s, late 1800s, and Leigh knows this very well, is we can say these things were stolen, but hell, we don't have a police report, that says, yeah, this item such and such was stolen, here's the image and such, and that doesn't happen. So at least from here on, we need to have something on our books at each tribe that's going to give some teeth to say that if these things are removed, that they were stolen, and we'll leave that to some good lawyering to make that, give the language to it. I'll leave it at that.
When we started the programs at Navajo to address repatriation issues, we realized quickly that, I was probably only 30 years old or so then, that we needed some expert guidance. And so what we did was we invited various singers or chanters, hatalis from across the reservation to give us some guidance on exactly what our priority should be with NAGPRA. And they had said that, first of all ceremonial items nationally, authentic ceremonial items nationally and even internationally should come home. That's been the charge of the Historic Preservation Department's repatriation program, and they've been doing that for quite some time now. But in terms of the NAGPRA and the international issues, we're dealing with issues, stuff that happened that left the reservation or left Navajo lands or Indian lands back in the 1800s, and we're trying to retroly correct those actions. But I'm going to take just a little different take, especially given on Navajo. I'm a federal government employee, and I'm very happy that they put money in my bank account every 2 weeks. But I don't think government really is the answer. I think that we need to do a little bit more within our tribal nations, especially here, especially I'll talk about Navajo a little bit more, to really discourage this as a practice within our own communities. I mean, like I said, I've been working with traditional communities most of my life. I have never yet to this day, and if there are traditional Navajos out there, listen to me, I have never yet heard a traditional Navajo chanter or singer say these things should never be made for sale to the outside. Yes, I mean, there is some payment for the creation. A lot of that Navajo gist that you see out there can still be being made today. That knowledge still exists. And in fact, if there is a new singer that's been ordained, they will make that gist for them, and sometimes they will repatriate some items for them, but the knowledge still exists to make these all new gist. I just think that we need to have that discussion internally within ourselves on a cultural, on a person, face-to-face with other people in our communities to say that these should not leave the reservations. And I don't think that, to me, that's more of an effective way of dealing with it, because you're dealing with it at the home communities at the local level, than expecting the federal government to right our own wrongs.
When NAGPRA was enacted back in 1990, what I find interesting, really, when you study NAGPRA and the law, is that the time it was passed by Congress and signed into law, it recognized immediate legal proprietary rights to these items by the holders of these items, museums and other institutions. It also placed immediately a lot on the tribes. The burden immediately became the tribe's responsibility to prove that these items, one, were authentic, so to speak, and belonged to the tribe, and the tribe wanted them for again, the perpetuation of culture. I think that process, I think, needs to be examined. I believe it's time that the museums are challenged to prove to the tribes that they do have legal ownership of these items. You know, Jim mentioned, and I mentioned Cushing. We deciphered Cushing's code, and I'm sure that code was applied up in Zuni too. We knew Cushing took a lot of grave goods from our cemeteries. You know, because we do place funeral objects on top of the graves. So in other words, until someone makes an effort, due diligence to examine the accession record and the accession of these items, I think it's up to the museums, and it should be changed in law where the museums and other institutions should be the one with the burden. In Cushing's case, these were stolen items, clearly. And I don't think if we can identify grave goods coming out of Hopi, that they should even be subject to NAGPRA. As of 1990, Congress also legalized immediately the ownership of human remains. I thought that ended after the Civil War, when no one could own another person. We consider our ancestral remains still people. And I thought that ended, but NAGPRA legalized ownership of human remains. And I think that needs to be examined as well.
I have this process of identifying and legalizing who owns what. You know, we talked about museums in this case. We're talking about the responsibility U.S. Forest Service, the Bureau of Land Management. I don't know if anybody's heard about Fun Valley, but that was 19,000 acres where the four-wheelers were given opportunities to travel wherever they wanted, and they were creating such havoc, and they were exposing not only human remains but artifacts. Just like the museums have that responsibility, we put the onus, and we have now at least one law enforcement person. So that's one issue. We do report vandalism. We have hundreds of sites in Tewa, in our Tewa world, and we do follow up with police reports. But to where that goes, you know, you have to find a product, and most people whoever buy it, you know, could be in France. So that's one issue. The other one is private owners. NAGPRA does not involve with private owners. You find, I had the privilege to go with the Ute Mountain Ute, and we went into their section of the Mesa Verde historic sites. Because of my responsibility and my connections to NAGPRA, they showed us, they dug up full potteries sized, and you know, it was just gorgeous, and their shards are this big. They're huge. But again, that just giving you an idea what private, supposedly, correct me, Leigh, because along that whole, from Mesa Verde, that whole section around Cortez, there's 50,000 sites, and mostly owned, privately owned. And they can do whatever with this because that's their land. And then the next item that I want to talk about has to do with the process that Brian brought out. We are now looking at a sacred item with couplet, and it's I got to take the medicine people over there to look at it. It is ours. We've identified it, but we're going to look at it. And in our religion, it has to go back where it came from because it's a living object, as Leigh has indicated. but right now where it came from is now a lake. So we have to do different process. What do we do? What do we, and then it has to be religiously accepted. When we repatriate that, it has to be within an associated area that has the same meaning of where it was originally taken. It's a very complicated one, but once you turn it over to your religious people, that they quantify it, they certify it, and that brings holism back to that image and to that life, because they're still alive. Thank you.
During our last panel presentation, Dr. Rosita Worrell of the Sea Alaska Corporation made some pretty bold statements, and one of them being that NAGPRA was a good policy. And she also shared some news about some developments within some of the national Native organizations that are emerging, including this tax credit resolution, I understand, which is before the National Congress of American Indians. And this is geared towards enticing the private sector to return objects back to communities. Now, whether or not this particular policy actually becomes law is yet to be seen. But this is one example of maybe a creative thought process that's happening within Indian country and different parts of the world or of our country that are being considered. The UNESCO guidelines for international repatriation is another one. This is one that's specific for museums. Again, a concept. Where this ends up leading is unknown. I think there are several tribes in different parts of the country who are considering, I guess, signing on to the official initiative. But my question to the panelists would be then, how do you see some of these playing out? I mean, is it, we I think all agree that NAGPRA is, tribes still face a lot of challenges in its implementation, in the understanding and interpretation of it. And so addressing repatriation on an international level, and with some of maybe these strategies that are in the works, how do you see some of these things playing out? Might they be useful? Is there a different strategy that can be incorporated? I'd really like to just hear your thoughts on some of these things.
Yeah, I had this conversation last week at the National Museum of Australia. The Australians, the Aboriginal communities there are thinking very hard about this, as we are. And while there are some legal instruments that have limited force, I think they need to be strengthened with obviously input, collaboration from communities. Yeah, the trouble, as I was saying earlier, was we're dealing with people who are buying things, or trading things, and greed is a powerful drug. And it may take time for the ethical side of humanity to catch up. In the meantime, I think some of these declarations, these guidelines, NAGPRA and others are good blueprints for, I think, affecting the way humanity behaves. The laws will come into place over time, but we have to keep the pressure on. It is our MO, it's our modus operandi. We're always up against things like this. But with folks like this, we've got some good, powerful thinkers in this room, And we have another generation that's coming up, and that same needs to be passed on to them too. Because we won't be doing this forever, but it's going to take time. So we have another generation to enable as well.
In terms of, people are now looking at perhaps, particularly the private sector, looking at tax credit if they, in fact, voluntarily return some of these items. We've been dealing with some repatriation for a long time at Hopi. And the Hopi tribe has made a policy decision that we will not provide anyone that is willing to repatriate items a tax break. The philosophy is that we just never will place any kind of price on our religious items, period. Over time, interestingly, however, particularly since the Paris auctions began, we've had private collectors or individuals who hold Hopi items contacting the tribe. And for I think almost all of them that I've dealt with since the Paris auctions, were willing to repatriate these items without conditions. And so we were having a little success in doing that as well. So I think it's an interesting proposal, but I think individually tribes like Hopi may have some other views on that at this point.
This sounds so much like California's turning your gun for a gift certificate. I because this is probably not my arena. I support the attitudes that are being expressed now, and I do give credence to what Azuni said, and that is, our hope is in our young people. And we have right now over 200 our young people, all the way from Harvard to Haskell to Fort Lewis. They're all over and they are our brain trust. So hopefully they'll be more adequate to answer this pretty important question, because we're now global. It's not just global warming, we're global. So, thank you.
That is an interesting thought about, tax credits and so on. And, I would like to just, sing Kumbaya and everybody give the dish back and we'd be done with it and not have to deal all of this. I think the private sector can certainly play a role in the repatriation of human remains and also in the repatriation of ceremonial items, both nationally and internationally. In fact, one of the earliest repatriation cases, if you remember, Leigh, was with Elizabeth Sackler. There was some masks that were on sale in New York City way back in 1992, and she bought the mask and some Hopi items and returned them. And I think and I don't know if her repatriation foundation is still active, but she started a foundation after that. It was called the American Indian Ritual Object Repatriation Foundation, I think, and then she worked very hard to work with tribes and get the repatriation. I think we need some more of those kinds of efforts. And I applaud the Hopi tribe for taking a stand about not purchasing them. Navajo, unfortunately, has taken another role and has purchased masks both in the 2014 auction, but also bought another set of masks and for a very large sum of money in January. So, and I'm hoping that maybe this discussion will about changes and maybe a different focus. That discussion needs to happen at Navajo. And I think that, we are, at least for the, and I was telling a friend of mine that, I'm happy that these masks are coming home, but, with the last purchase, we're feeling the market for these. And that's the other big nasty part of having to pay for those masks.
Thank you, gentlemen. At this time, I'd like to open up the floor for questions. Sorry. I'd like to open up the floor for questions for our panelists. Yes, sir.
You know, the auctions continue. In 2013, it went worldwide, and it brought in a lot of attention to these auctions. It also prompted internal within the United States, of course, reaction, particularly among museums and private collectors. The auctions continue. There's an active investigation going on right now, sponsored primarily by Hopi and Acoma and Laguna, which indicates that since the first auction, when the Hopis went to French court and protested that and challenged it legally, there seems to be also an activity in international trafficking, primarily to get these items off and sold before, quote unquote, at least one collector told me, before the Hopis get them. So something's going on over there. We're currently looking at what we're referring to as the French Ring. And generally speaking, we now know where their headquarters are. We know what they're up to. The last direct contact with members of this French Ring was just past July over here in Santa Fe, in which, again, with law enforcement, we did an undercover sting. And so that's now an active case that is moving towards trial. So I think something's going on out there, but it's going to take, again, a concerted effort to really study that and find out.
Jim?
Yeah, there's some countries that have laws against selling of this kind of patrimony and objects. And so there are havens for this kind of market. But also underlying that is this issue of the provenance of these objects. And there is some kinds of, how would you say, like convenient amnesia around the provenance of objects. That people deliberately do not say who owned it and when it changed hands and the timelines for those things. So that's another part of this that we're working against. As far as rules about tribal members making things that would be ceremonial, ritual, and to be sold, there are unwritten laws in our communities, well, at least Zuni anyway, unwritten laws, and the consequences can be very severe. Not to mention just the bad karma, and people that do these kinds of things, it just comes around. Bad things end up happening to them. They have some very bad karma. So it doesn't happen just to them alone. It happens to the whole community, and we all suffer from it.
I know in my discussion with the Navajo Office of Historic Preservation, I know that they're now actively working with the Tribal Council to legislate some laws against selling jish to non-Navajos. So I know that effort is being done, and I know that the Tribal Council has established the Human Rights Commission under the Tribal Council, and they're working with also the U.S. district attorneys and the State Department and so on to try to prevent further selling of Navajo jish in the international market or even domestically. So I know that's being done, and I have to just repeat or emphasize what Jim has said in terms of just doing this. I mean, for the Navajo to just make fake jish or to sell jish, I mean, that's bad karma. you know, because it does affect not only you, but it does affect the family and the community. And that's something that and that hopefully will prevent people, but it doesn't. So.
I just have an idea of your question. That is, as I said before, I'm a certified New Mexico Site Watch. That's a kind of a volunteer. And you know what, because there are so many people that are so computer savvy, so network savvy, that, you know, if we could enlist your help, you know, and I really believe, and I've known this gentleman here quite a long time, and he comes from one of the more sophisticated preservation systems, and you know, but if we could invoke that, you all to look at the network system, and maybe call the people that you know. In this case, the Hopi, the Zunis, well, any of the tribal people, that they can lead you into the right direction. But I think we need your help there, because you have the minds and you're at the expertise, and you could help us. I think that's what we're looking for: alliances, partnerships. Thank you.
Brian, thank you. Yes, Jim.
I would like to thank the people that have come here, also the audience, but also the School for Advanced Research, because this is about our issues here, but it's also about mediating the different kind of knowledges and values that are out there. That's the only way we're going to get to the bottom of this, is learn how to mediate these sort of things. And having forums like this will be a part of it.
Thank you, Jim. Another question? Yes, ma'am.
The sentiment, it brought tears to my eyes when what was happening to those ancient sites that have been in our world so long, and just gave us and our young people so much stimulus to want to save them and to perpetuate that honor of human beings and how we rose from where we were at. Thank you for that. And I did have that thought. How do we do this in that level? I think the panel here probably could answer that in a more appropriate manner, but I wanted just to highlight what you just said. That is so dehumanizing.
Well, with some of us who deal with repatriation and now exposure to the international scene, I mean, we're but a small voice. But I think what is being alluded to is really the what's happening in those countries that unfortunately are in a state of war. I think that's what you're talking about. But I think there needs to be a clear awareness of also the popular term historical trauma caused to Native people here over time. And really that's the looting of our cultures, you know, and I think NAGPRA is a law with results. And I think that needs to somehow be brought into the forefront of public education. And, you know, while NAGPRA has some good results, you know, I think for many tribes it's opened up really this history, particularly at the turn of the century, of how many of the tribal cultures were looted. You know, when major ceremonial items, for example, or ritual altars are taken, what it did in Third Mesa with Oraibi, it caused about almost 7 out of 18 ritual societies to go into extinction because the altars were no longer available for initiations. And that's the suffering that I think, in our case with the Hopi tribe, you know, I look at. And so, yeah, I think there has to be a open dialogue and a real concerted effort to do some public education like with these types of forums and to get the word out.
I talked a little bit earlier about having the opportunities for recognizing that what we believe in and what we hold dear and what is really part of the human experience as a whole, we all contribute to that. How valuable is that? How valuable is indigenous knowledge and perspective compared to, say, science? How do we learn across knowledge systems? How do we mediate knowledges? And how do we mediate values? So, in one sense, we might be preaching to the choir, right? And that's still good. That's still good. On another sense, maybe some pragmatism needs to be brought to this as well. And I hate to use the word value in this term, in this area. But where there are people that are dealing with these kind of antiquities and moving them, trading them, and so on, that's what they're thinking, is the value of things. I hate using that word here, but as I alluded to before, there's authenticity. And I'm going to say it again, I hate to use the word value, but if these people are living in this world where authenticity and value is important to them, then we need to remind them that the only people that can authenticate things are people from the source. And that's part of our indigenous local knowledge. So how valuable is that? And it still goes back to mediating and understanding that. We have to be pragmatic in this. We have to be very pragmatic. And if it's around highlighting the matters of law, we'll do that. We'll bring that to the front. And as I said, I think scholars need to be talking about more around the possession and dispossession, the asymmetry of powers. And I think that forums like this are incredible. We'll have some spin-offs because I know all of you will take this somewhere. But let's be thinking collectively about how we can become pragmatic in this approach. That's the next challenge.
I'll start. I'll give. Well, I don't think that the medicine people want chips in their chips. At Navajo, the ceremonial items rests with a single individual. They control that, and so that's. They oversee that, they take care of that. And I know that in terms of security, modern methods of inserting chips and all that just is not something that they would consider. But there are now some efforts by the tribal government to make sure that these items, when they're no longer usable, or when the person who uses those for ceremony dies or is unable to give them to an apprentice, that there is a mechanism for them to actually give them to a program under the Navajo Nation government to take care of. And they keep that under the traditional cultural program. They have a storage facility where they do keep that. So that's a way for the Navajo people, the Navajo government, to try to control the commerce of these items. So that people can bring those items in because nobody's able to take care of them, or they're not able to put them away or put them back to nature and so on. So that's a way that the tribe is working to make sure that they don't end up on the commercial market.
I think that's a easy proposal, seemingly, but cultures are complicated. A lot of these items we can never photograph. They're only taken out at specific time. Highly esoteric. And those Hopis that are initiated into these societies have no privileges and rights to see them. all we've done out in Hopi since particular the auctions came about is to work with the villages in terms of doing something like that. So I know in my Kiva group over in Third Mesa, we talked about it in the Kiva. So pretty much all of our katsina friends have now different kind of identifiers inside, you know, I don't like to use the term mask, but the katsina friend. And they come in different forms. One actually use, what do you call those? Use it for 4-H, for leathercraft? Chips. Well, yeah. But anyway, they put their name and the village on there. They just literally carved it inside. And then some used magic markers to put their names on. Things like that, of course, are local and far and few in between. And yes, I wish we could inventory everything, but boy, it's a very complicated culture.
Take one more question.
Yeah, thank you. I hope that we would at least end up with that discussion. You know, the Hopi tribe sought relief, temporary relief, against the auction house, meaning that we wanted to have these Hopi items removed until such time we further investigate the history of these items. So we sued the auction house in French court. And our argument, as in generally speaking, was the fact that once we got through the reviewing of, you know, all we could use were photographs, and clearly a lot of them were quote unquote authentic. We argued that the tribe, one, they were unlawfully taken off the Hopi reservation. We ran into the law enforcement standards, however, because we didn't have police reports. FBI couldn't do much for us at that point. We argued that they were cultural patrimony and that the Hopi tribe never willfully transferred or abrogated any rights to these items. Well, that being said, what the French court did, and remember this French law, so I'm sure it happens here, but the first question was that whether or not the Hopi tribes had any legal standing, and the answer 4 times now was no. We didn't have legal standing. As to the rightful ownership, the court was interested in whether or not the seller, the family, had what they called a certificate of rightful possession, which is primarily proof of legal ownership. Well, the court was just only interested in as to whether or not that French family could prove that they had ownership. So all they did was produce a receipt saying that they bought it from another French family. That's how narrow the court ruled and said you do have certificate of rightful ownership. And then the court also took a look at another section under their law, saying that if any item, if any property initially is arguably religious and sacred, it loses its sacredness once it's commodified. So these objects are not considered sacred under French law, even though the Hopi tribe was yelling and hollering that they were. And those were the results 4 times. Very narrow decisions.
Okay. Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, and thank you to all of you for joining us this evening.